I like to think of pointing out instructions sort of like what we find in a tour guide. Let's say, I remember once going to Italy and going to Pompeii and taking a tour bus, and on the bus before we got to the ruins, the tour guide person said, and when you get out of the bus there'll be a large flat rock and you'll see grooves in it. And those are the grooves of all the chariot tracks. Now, had I gone by myself, I would have seen a flat rock. But once the tour guide pointed out that these grooves were chariot, I looked at it in a different way. And I saw the chariot tracks.
Yes.
And what a master does in the relationship when pointing something out is point out things that might be quite perfectly obvious once they're pointed out. But without those special instructions, you would only see rocks. Okay. That's how meditation was originally taught. In fact, in Mahamudra, which is tradition that I teach, people were sung into awakening with little poem songs called dohas. The average time was 20 minutes to several days.
So they could actually be sung into awakening?
Yes, exactly. And then what happened is that, about the 11th century, when meditation had become very popular, you get these big monasteries. In other words, what we're talking about is the institutionalization of meditation. Large groups of people, maybe 300, maybe 5,000, all sitting. And they're not followed very carefully anymore.
Yes.
They're not followed very carefully. And then about 13th, 14th century, you get hundreds and hundreds of books written in Tibet about the problems of meditation. And all those books were written because of the institutionalization of meditation, and it wasn't being followed very carefully. And you see, unfortunately, those are the traditions that got transferred to the West. So when people go on a retreat currently in Western countries, what happens is they'll maybe sit for 10 days or 3 months, and every 3 days they'll go for a group interview with 6 or 8 or 10 other people, and they'll get asked a question or two about their practice, and they usually said, keep on going. But nobody follows it carefully. Nobody is listening carefully and saying, now focus on it like this. Or, this is a problem, this is how you correct it. And in a relational-based way of teaching this, you are always using the relationship to guide the meditation, to point out what you want the person to be able to see, to bring forth that realization. And then based on their description, you can tell reasonably so where the problems are, and you can make the correction with them. That's the old way of teaching the meditation. That's the kind of meditation we're trying to bring back. Because the institutionalized forms of meditation, the danger of that is that people sit for long times, and we've seen many Western students who've sat for 20 or 30 years, and their practice is bottomed out. Because there are many points where you get stuck, and the students don't even realize that they're stuck. Because the mind seems quiet. But it doesn't ever go any further than that, and they certainly won't awaken. There's an old Sufi tale that says, a log sits on the woodpile for months and years, but a log never realizes God. So don't sit like a log. Sit intelligently. Use your intelligence to look at whether the meditation is on track, and work in a relationship to help keep it on track.
Yeah.
So you bring the very best of the meditation out. Meditation isn't about sitting still. It's not about relaxing. It's hard work. It's about awakening.
And so what is awakening?
It's a good question. And it depends on the tradition. Okay. For example, within Buddhism itself, there are 2 answers to that question, whether we take the older Theravadan Buddhism or the newer Mahayana Buddhism. In the older Theravadan Buddhism, a lot of what was focused on is this issue of reactivity, how the mind incessantly goes towards things it likes to make more of it, and to go away from things it doesn't like. Every moment in our waking life, the mind is reactive like that. In the older Buddhism, there's a point in the meditation practice where everything drops away, the body, the content of the mind, and there's this vast ocean of pure awareness, just for an instant. And then following that, when the content of the mind comes back, what's gone away is all that reactivity. Once you have a taste of that ocean of awareness, which is the ground of being, then it eradicates that reactivity.
That's like a new reference point that's available.
That's a new reference point. It's a new, I like to call a new basis of operation.
Okay.
You are not dwelling within your personal identity, your individual consciousness. Your reference point that has no reference point is that ocean of awareness itself. Okay, that's your new basis of operation. The older language to describe that tend to be somewhat spatial, going to the other shore. But it's not like a place that you're going to. It's not like a state that you're going to. It's just the realization of what's always right here, which is your real nature. And you operate out of that.
But once we lose, why do we lose the ocean of awareness once we've found it?
Now, the issue is that old habits of mind come up again to obscure that. Some people have this view that if you get a taste of awakening, nothing is ever the same again. And it's true in one sense. That once you get a taste of that ground of your being, there's no more searching. Sometimes it's said this is the path that ends all paths, because even a little taste of that, even if it's unstable, it eradicates any doubt about what you're looking for, even if it's unstable. Now, why people lose it have to do with the habits of mind, our ordinary sense of self, our personal identity, the sense of a world that's out here, that gets too solid again. Yeah. We get into those habits again, and we lose it. We start dwelling within our basis of operation becomes our personal identity. It becomes our individual consciousness rather than the ground of our being, Dharmakaya awareness. So, you see, there is a relapse and relapse prevention literature in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. Some people get little flames and they lose it, and then the object becomes how you make those little flames of awakening a forest fire. So it's always here all the time.
You talk in the book about the two paths to enlightenment, whatever we call it, and the one path is the gradual path, and there's the more sudden path, or not so much a path, the sudden realization.
Yes, and I want to come back to this question also about the difference between the awakening and Mahayana Buddhism.
Right.
Because it's very different, and maybe I'll answer that one first and come back to this issue.
Yeah.
Because in the older Buddhism, the Theravadan Buddhism, you could find a good example of that in the stages of the practice would be called the path of purification, or the Visiddhamagga. It's a great description of the stages of meditation in Theravadan Buddhism. And in that there's a particular level of deep concentration, or samadhi, where everything pulses like a strobe light. And if you keep looking at it, there's a tendency to look at the going out rather than the coming into existence of each one of those pulses or mind moments. And after a while, everything starts breaking up. All the basic elements of the mind dissolve, break up. It's called Bhanganyana, or a dissolution experience. It's not a very pleasant experience.
I can imagine it can be very scary, actually.
Sometimes it's accompanied by great fear or disgust. But one of the things that happens is that through that experience you begin to see that there's an awareness that isn't connected with all those little activities of the mind. The awareness sort of pervades or saturates all of that. And that becomes the point to really begin to look at the nature of awareness itself, you see.